Hi, everyone. Thank you for your patience. We are clearly experiencing some technical difficulties and apologize for the delay in our presentation. Thank you again, Dr. Hahn, for rolling with this. We're so looking forward to your talk. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Again, it's an honor to be here and speaking in front of this group and anyone else who's online right now. This group has done a lot in terms of aging research and increasing our knowledge about how cognitive aging happens, so it's quite an honor. I'm going to be talking about my research, which is focused on financial decision making in older age, and particularly I'm going to be talking from neuropsychology, neuroimaging, and some policy considerations. I'm going to speak fast to try to make up some time. I have nothing to disclose. I'm a board-certified clinical neuropsychologist, and I serve as an oral examiner for the board exam process. I was the director of neuropsychology at the Long Beach VA, and now a director of neuropsychology at Family Medicine at the Keck School of Medicine of USC. And I've always been interested in cognitive decline in the context of aging, or otherwise known as cognitive aging and Alzheimer's disease. And it's really from this space where a lot of my interests in financial decision-making grew out of. And I'll just share a quick anecdote that I started getting interested in this topic because I started seeing patients in my clinic that were referred for cognitive assessments because it was presumed that they were having early signs of dementia. Because family members were discovering that these patients were giving away large sums of money to the pretty girl next door or the handsome boy next door. So clearly the family thought this is early Alzheimer's disease and brought them in for a cognitive assessment. But time and again, each one of these patients actually tested normal, at least using the tests that we were using at the time. This was obviously frustrating to the family members because they thought clearly this was a change in behavior. It was a change in behavior. This was frustrating from our perspective, just because our tests weren't picking up on this consideration of financial decision making in old age. It's out of the space and in these interests of what impacts cognitive decline in the context of aging that this research really bore itself out of. And a lot of my work before this was actually focused on pre-Alzheimer's and early signs of Alzheimer's dementia from a neuropsychology perspective, trying to understand this using neuroimaging and genetics. And so this is the backdrop to my program of research that I'm going to be sharing today. So what you may or may not know is that older adults hold a third of the nation's wealth. This was based on the work of David Leibson, who's an economist at Harvard, and this was based on estimates in 2011. So it's likely that older adults hold more than a third of the nation's wealth at this point. However, a portion of older adults lose quite a bit of money to financial scam and fraud, and some estimate this to be on the conservative end around $3 billion, on the higher end about $36 billion, and I even saw one estimate that estimated this in the $300 million range. And the problem is so significant that the FBI maintains a website devoted to this topic. And so you can see here, this is what the website looks like. It describes all the frauds and scams currently known against seniors. There's lots of resources, and there's a lot of interest in trying to address this topic of financial exploitation risk in older age. Now, it may not come as a surprise that some older adults might be susceptible to financial scam and fraud in older age. We know, and this is based on the work of a lot of people, that there are brain changes that happen over the course of aging. And so this is a figure that shows the brain regions that tend to decline in volume or in cortical thickness, I should say, as we grow older. And a lot of these brain regions are in the frontal lobes, which we also know are involved in decision-making abilities. However, one point I'd like to make is that this is actually a very heterogeneous picture. So what I showed you before was an overall general picture of brain decline and aging. What you're seeing now is actually individual depictions of specific brain regions and how they change with age. And you can see that some brain regions decline with age a little bit more clearer than others. So in the top, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but in the top upper left picture is the lateral prefrontal cortex. And you can see there's a pretty clear decline with age in that brain region across all the individuals. However, if you look at the box directly below it, in the inferior temporal cortex, there's actually quite a bit of heterogeneity in terms of the time course. So some people actually decline with age. However, there's examples of increases with age in that brain region. And so again, the picture, the bottom line here is that there's heterogeneity in this picture of age-related brain structural decline. And with that brain structural decline, generally speaking, we see some correspondence to cognition declines. But again, the point here, and actually this is a lot of this understanding is due to Denise Park's work at your center. We know that there's heterogeneity in the cognitive abilities that decline with age. And so you can see here a number of different processes seem to decline with age. Perhaps notably, speed of processing is something that seems pretty reliable. So it does tend to be the case that we will get a bit slower as we grow older with age, and that's part of the normal aging process. However, some abilities seemingly increase with age as well, at least until the much older ages. And you can see here word knowledge is one area that may increase with age. So again, there's a heterogeneity in the way that cognitive abilities change with age, and that's important to note. So around this time when we first started talking about this topic, the New York Times came out with an article that suggested, anecdotally again, that financial decision-making might be one of the earliest signs of Alzheimer's disease. And this is something that we, being in an Alzheimer's center at the time, took a lot of interest in because we're always interested in what may be an early sign of Alzheimer's disease, even ahead of any noticeable cognitive decline or impairment. And so this article came out that suggested changes in the way people handle finances, interact with finances, might be one of the earliest signs of Alzheimer's disease ahead of any noticeable cognitive decline. And so this seemed to fit the picture of those clinical patients that I was seeing way at the beginning of my talk that I mentioned here. It could be that we might be seeing one of the earliest signs of Alzheimer's disease. And so just to highlight a few pieces of work that we did to look into this some more. Here we looked using the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center cohorts at a mild cognitive impairment. And mild cognitive impairment is a condition that's known as a pre-Alzheimer's condition. And this is something that we wanted to see if people with MCI actually showed poor decision-making compared to people without MCI, without mild cognitive impairment. And this work, I believe, looked at over 400 or 500 non-demented older adults in the Chicagoland area. And here we see that total decision-making was poorer in the people with mild cognitive impairment. So that seems to make sense. So if someone's having cognitive impairment, they might be more inclined to make poor financial and healthcare decisions. We also looked at a measure of susceptibility to scams, and this is a measure that was developed by my colleague, Dr. Patricia Boyle at the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center. And here we find that people with MCI actually also seem to show more susceptibility to scams, and this is controlling for age, education, and sex. And we also looked at specific cognitive domains that seem to be driving this here. We also looked at financial and health literacy, financial and health literacy is important to consider because we find in our work that financial and health literacy seems to really help make better financial and healthcare decisions. And that seems to make sense for a whole bunch of reasons. Here we see that financial and health literacy is actually lower in people with MCI, but we find this interesting interaction effect with education, where people who are more highly educated seem to have less of that loss that comes with MCI, the condition of MCI. And so that just points to the importance, again, of education. So clearly, it's the case that if someone's having cognitive impairment, they might make more or poorer decisions when it comes to financial matters. However, it's not just about cognitive ability. And I think the anecdotes that I shared at the beginning illustrate that. I think the New York Times article suggests that it could be the case that there could be discrepancies between cognition, cognitive ability, and decision-making ability, at least how we're defining it. And so I wanted to look and see how often this happened in a group of non-demented older adults. And so in this group of over 600 non-demented older adults, we found that actually about 25% or a quarter of that non-demented older adult group showed a significant discrepancy, a statistically significant discrepancy between their decision-making ability and their cognitive ability. Now, what's interesting is that what you're seeing here in blue are the cases where they actually have equivalent decision-making ability to their cognitive ability, and that was the vast majority here, and that makes sense. However, we saw examples or cases where people had higher decision-making ability relative to their cognitive ability and lower decision-making ability relative to their cognitive ability. Now, we predicted the lower decision-making ability relative to the cognitive ability, but the higher decision-making ability relative to the cognitive ability was a bit of a surprise. There does seem to be a portion of older adults that show that. So there does seem to be a little bit of a separation, if you will, that could be considered when you're considering someone's global cognitive ability and their decision-making ability. So if an older adult shows impaired financial decision-making or becomes the victim of a scam or fraud, the burden is widespread. Everyone around that older adult feels that. Family members, caretakers, the community around that older adult. And a lot of really important work recently that has come out from my colleague Patricia Boyle and my colleague Chris Stewart has shown that reduced scam awareness and poor decision-making may be early signs of Alzheimer's disease. They're associated with later incident Alzheimer's disease. And that could happen without any noticeable cognitive impairment, actually. So in those models that they recently published on, they controlled for cognition. So this does seem to be something that could be at least distinguishable from cognitive ability. So understanding this is an incredible public health issue because it has wide-reaching effects. Actually, Patricia Boyle published a study showing that poor decision-making is associated with higher mortality. So it's even associated with higher rates of death. But the problem is how can we understand this? So when you're talking about financial decision-making, that's actually an incredibly complex thing, right? Like it includes your cognitive ability, but there's also emotions involved, being able to emotionally regulate. There could be societal or contextual factors involved, right? So social isolation or loneliness might have an impact on that. So it's a really big topic to try to understand. So I'm going to propose that one way that we can understand this is by using neuroimaging. And so this is one of the ways that we've tried to understand this very broad, daunting topic. And we know that neuroimaging changes in brain function can occur years before the onset of cognitive impairment. And this is from some seminal work from Susan Resnick's group at NIH. So we know that if we look at the brains of older adults as they're making decisions, that could be one way that we can potentially see these early changes that might be associated with Alzheimer's disease down the road, but might also be impacting financial decision-making now. And so this approach is broadly can be construed as a neuroeconomic approach, where brain imaging and computational neuroscience methods are used to elucidate biological principles of, or biological economic principles, how people make economic decisions. And so that's something that I wanted to acknowledge. And in that acknowledgement, there's a lot of much better people than me in that field. So I just wanted to highlight a few of these people, including Greg Semenez-Larkin, who's done a lot of really great work in this space. And so anyway, all of this led to my Beeson Career Development Award, which is something that Kendra mentioned at the beginning of our talk. This was something that was a hugely collaborative effort. You can see here the mentoring team spanning Rush, University of Michigan, Harvard, Cornell, and Keck, actually. And this Beeson Career Development Award is a special one because I just wanted to I wanted to highlight this for people who might be interested in it. It's a hybrid funded by public and private foundations, so it's actually much. It's a prestigious award, and I encourage anyone who's thinking about career development awards to check it out. So using and leveraging some Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center studies, we've been able to actually come at this with a very multidisciplinary collaborative approach. And so I just wanted to highlight the Rush Memory and Aging Project, which a lot of this work is embedded in, is something that has been going on for many years now, decades actually. And what they do is they file follow people annually until they die. And then after they die, they actually collect the brain. So there's neuropathology data after people die as well. It's a large study. There's a decision-making sub-study, which is headed by Dr. Patricia Boyle again, who heads these studies. And all of this data is actually freely accessible through their data access website. And so I'm happy to share more about that if anyone's interested. But again, this is highlighting this multidisciplinary approach. And so, and this slide is really just to sort of show you what goes into this. So the Memory Imaging Project is collecting cognitive data. The decision-making project that's headed by Dr. Boyle is collecting decision-making data, behavioral economic data. And this equation here is the equation of how to calculate someone's financial risk aversion. Now, I have no clue what that means, actually, or how to translate that. But what I can do is if there's a value that's derived from that, I can actually use that value and use it in neuroimaging, which is something I do know. And so the neuroimaging portion of this is the grant that I was talking about, which is the Beeson K Award. And so I'm going to share some preliminary findings. I guess they're not preliminary at this point. That's been published for a number of years, but share some of our findings in a bit. When we started this work, it was impressed upon us by Randy Buckner at Harvard to have an idea of what is happening in the brain. And so this comes from one of Randy's papers. And here he talks about how amyloid plaque deposition seems to map on this default network, the default mode network. And that same network seems to atrophy in the course of Alzheimer's disease. And so there does seem to be this this model of neuropathology impacting brain and then resulting in brain degradation. However, one thing I always like to point out is that this picture is a little bit incomplete in the sense that there's a lot of amyloid deposition in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, medial prefrontal cortex areas. Those are implicated in the default mode network, but those don't seem to decline in the context of Alzheimer's disease. And it's my general thought that the amyloid deposition still has an impact on function in this early course of Alzheimer's disease. So amyloid might impact the function and the function connectivity of these medial prefrontal cortices. These medial frontal regions are critical for financial decision making and are susceptible to amyloid. So could we be seeing an early impact on financial decision making from this early age-related neuropathological accumulation? That's basically what we think. This is a study from Peters and Bushell, and they actually highlight brain regions that are involved in temporal discounting decision making. And what's interesting is that a lot of these same brain regions are impacted by this age-associated Alzheimer's neuropathology, amyloid specifically, in the same brain regions that I was mentioning before. And so this is sort of all hopefully coming together in this current working model where we see neuropathological accumulation impacting default mode network. If this accumulation in the posterior regions results in the classic cognitive or memory declines, but this accumulation in the anterior regions might result in a decline in financial decision making. And even though that doesn't structurally decline early in the course of AD, that still does contribute ultimately to the AD picture. So this gets into more specifics, and again, for the sake of time, we have specific hypotheses with regards to what connections where might change. But again, for the sake of time, I'll just go ahead and move on. To cover, show you some of the neuroimaging work to date. I'm going to show you something from risk aversion. So risk aversion is how willing someone is to actually deal with a risk situation. So would you prefer $15 for sure or a coin toss where you get a certain amount greater than 15 if you flip heads or nothing if you flip tails? So this is a classic neuroeconomic gamble. We wanted to look, and this was the first study that we published in this space. We wanted to look to see if we can just see any differences in the brain using people who are high and low in risk aversion. To make a long story short, we did see a lot of, or we did see some differences between people who are high and low in risk aversion. And again, this is in a relatively low number of subjects at the time. We wanted to look at temporal discounting, we know, because temporal discounting has been widely used in the behavioral economics literature. And temporal discounting gets at the tendency for someone to accept a reward, a smaller reward offered now or at an earlier time versus a larger reward offered at a later time. So a specific example is, say I give you the option of accepting $5 now or $20 an hour from now. Most people will just wait the $20 or wait the hour to get the $20 because that's a higher amount of money. And so this is something that we wanted to see if we can relate this to some neuroimaging metrics in the brain. So here we looked at 123 non-demented older adults using a seed region in the insula. And we found that people who made that higher payout decision, that tended to actually not temporally discount. So a lot of people consider that the better choice in this case. Those people had greater functional connectivity of the right parahippocampal gyrus to this seed region of interest. People who made the more immediately gratifying decisions had greater connectivity of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex to these anchor seed regions of interest. And so that was interesting to us. To our knowledge, this was the first study of temporal discounting in older adults using neuroimaging. And it really highlighted the importance of these memory networks being strong in making more optimal decisions, and in particular, the right parahippocampal gyrus. So this was followed up with a DTI study, which looks at structural connectivity in a group of 302 older adults, non-demented again. And here we found that greater structural connectivity was associated with better or less temporal discounting, so better choices on the temporal discounting task. So the stronger the connectivity of the brain, the better people tend to make choices in terms of temporal discounting. Again, we saw a little bit of a laterality effect here, where we saw more of the effect on the right side versus the left side. Financial literacy is, again, something that's important for making optimal financial decisions. Here we found that using a resting state approach, that in a group of 139 non-demented older adults, there was greater connectivity between the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate. So these are two important hubs of the default mode network. And then following this up again, using a structural a technique, DTI, using to look at structural connectivity, we found again, higher connectivity was associated with higher financial literacy. And again, this seems to be more so in the right hemisphere of the brain. And this is, I should say, a radiologic view. So left is right, right is left. So that's why it looks like it's on the left side of your screen, but it's actually the right side of the brain. Susceptibility to scams is something that we've looked at as well, and in a group of over 300 non-demented older adults. And I should say all of these models are adjusted for age, education, sex, and global cognition. This is something that is a scale that was developed again by Dr. Patricia Boyle. This was based on the work of AARP and FINRA. And you can see here the items seem to make sense. So for example, I answer the phone whenever it rings, even if I do not know who is calling. So if someone actually answers the phone whenever it rings and doesn't know who is calling, you can see that that person would be more susceptible to scams. Here we use a voxel-based approach, so it's a VBM approach, and found, and this was surprising to me, I wasn't expecting to see anything, in models that were adjusted for age, education, sex, and global cognition. We saw that less gray matter density in the right hippocampus specifically was associated with greater susceptibility to scams. Now, there's a lot of spread here. It's not an exact one-to-one correlation, but this was statistically significant. I was actually very surprised we saw anything here. So, and then following this up with a DTI study, again, looking at structural connectivity in the brain, we found that people who had less structural connectivity in the brain were more susceptible to scams or fraud. So we are seeing these brain metrics from neuroimaging that seem to suggest certain people might be more susceptible to scam or fraud versus others. Now, in summary of the neuroimaging portion of this, I should say that we are seeing a lot of our effects on the right hemisphere, and in particular the right temporal lobe. Now, whether or not that's actually a true effect or a true finding is still up for debate, but I just wanted to note it here. We're holding on to this lightly at this point, but it could be that brain changes in the right hemisphere, and in particular the right medial temporal lobe, might be associated with poor financial decision-making and greater susceptibility to scams. So there is some precedent for this thought. So work from Roberto Cabeza at Duke suggests that the right hemisphere might be one of the earliest signs of Alzheimer's or a pathological aging. So this is something that we are just keeping in the back of our heads at this point. So at this point in the talk, I usually like to take a little bit of a step back. So I showed you a lot of compelling brain images, so we're far from having a consensus in the field. So a lot of this work, admittedly, is some of the first work that's been done in older adults. But we need, in order to call something true in science, we need to actually make sure other people find the same thing, that the same finding is replicated in other population groups, and so on. And so until this becomes more replicated, I'd hate for anyone to run out of here thinking, okay, we can image someone and see how susceptible they are to scam or fraud. We are just not there yet. And there's a reason why I'm saying this so clearly right now, which I'll get at when I talk about policy at the end. So before I get to that, though, some additional thoughts and observations. When I was doing this work, I was actually not impressed with the racial descriptions of the populations, I'll say. In behavioral economic, neuroimaging work, there's very few studies that have a representation of minorities. And I just sort of, and some studies don't even talk about it at all, actually, which is sort of interesting to me. So however, or whether, or to the extent which decision-making abilities vary by race is largely unknown. And we also know that from the disparities literature, of which there's a vastly growing examples at this point, that contextual factors, so access to supportive resources, things like literacy, socioeconomic status, educational access, may explain a significant portion of any racial differences observed. And there's a great literature that shows how the lack of access to resources, things like structural racism has had an impact on health. And so it's using that framework that we want to try to understand decision making. And so at about the same time I started thinking about this, the NIA actually came out with its health disparities research framework. I had a conversation with someone from NIA about this, and just about the same time I was thinking about it, it sounds like they were thinking about it, so it was kind of a nice convergence of interests. And so what's great is that using the Rush cohorts in Chicago again, we could actually look at this. So Dr. Lisa Barnes is a pioneer in this work, looking at aging and cognition changes with respect to older Black adults. And so she's been running the MARS study for a number of years now. And the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center Clinical Core actually collects data on this as well, specifically focused on older Black adults. And so this became the impetus for my current R01, is to try to understand racial differences in decision-making among older adults. And really try to understand this from a contextual framework as well. So one example of this this grant initiative is this study I'm showing right here, which describes that literacy mediates racial differences in financial and healthcare decision-making in older adults. So if someone just looked and saw if there was a racial difference in financial and healthcare decision-making, it doesn't look like it, but it actually, what's interesting is that literacy actually mediates that. So once you consider someone's literacy in financial and health matters, that race difference goes away. And we know that literacy is an example of these contextual factors that relates to historical lack of supportive resources in older Black adults. So the racial difference is really attributable to this historic social inequity. And so it points to the importance of social justice issues and addressing those. This is the actual mediation model, in case you are interested. One of our recent papers from this work is looking at the effect of discrimination. And discrimination is something that we are finding seems to be associated with variations in functional connectivity of the insula of the brain. So the insula is associated with perceptions of trust. It's involved in decision making, and so it does seem to be the case that the experience of discrimination seems to have some functional impact on the insula in particular here, and so we're following up on that as well. Okay, so I've been focusing a lot on the brain and cognition, and this is the point in the talk where I usually take a step back and acknowledge that there are a lot of considerations when acknowledging financial decision making. And so this was something that informed a paper that I co-wrote with Mark Lax, who's the head of geriatrics at Cornell. He started seeing these cases that I opened my talk with in his practice independently in New York City. I was seeing cases in my practice on the West Coast. And so it was interesting because this was something that we both kind of came to an understanding about, and we were doing this from independent perspectives. So we co-wrote this, really highlighting the fact that there are lots of reasons why older adults might show poor financial decision making. A lot of this could be cognition driven, so this top consideration. But there's also medical considerations, so impaired mobility, serious progressive illness considerations, polypharmacy, the impact of medications. There's psychosocial considerations, so things like depression, social anxiety, or social isolation, loneliness, and then just environmental situations. So there are factors that are outside of the actual older adult. So just the fact of being targeting more is something that needs to be considered when considering financial decision making. So at USC, we are trying to follow up on the whole host of factors that might impact financial decision making in older adults. We are calling this the Finance, Cognition, and Health and Elder Study. And so this is actually, we're trying to leverage every tool we can think of to try to understand what may make a certain older adult more susceptible to scam or fraud or poor financial decision making. And so just to highlight some work from this, and this is actually from a group, from a study based at USC, we found that older adults who have been financially exploited report higher symptoms of depression, higher symptoms of anxiety, also more medical conditions and problems with sleep. And so those are all factors that might impact financial decision making. My postdoc, Dr. Jenna Axelrod, just recently published a paper showing that greater frailty is associated with financial exploitation. And this is specifically with regard to sensory functioning, so hearing and seeing. And then my former postdoc, who's now a tenure track assistant professor in Israel, just published a paper where we followed up on specific brain regions that we think are involved in financial exploitation. And here specifically the hippocampus, the insula, and the medial frontal cortex. And this was just published literally just a couple days ago. So, just in terms of a resource I want to highlight, the National Center on Elder Abuse is headed by my friend and colleague, Dr. Laura Mosqueda. They have a lot of resources on financial exploitation, if that's something that is of interest. And so they have a resource line, and we actually did a study where we looked at the types of calls that were made to that resource line and found that financial exploitation was far and away the highest or the most frequently reported form of elder abuse. And what's interesting is that it was mostly committed by a family member. And so in the elder abuse world, we know that this is the case, but this the fact that family members are involved in financial exploitation is still something that's not a well-known thing. And so when this study came out, it got a lot of press, US News and World Report, a whole lot of places picked up on this. So this is something that just wanted to highlight, and also the resource line in case anyone was interested in this. In terms of the science part of my talk, age-related and some summary points, age-related cognitive decline can make an older adult more susceptible to scams. Although poor cognition is associated with poor decision-making may not be solely due to poor cognition. A complex network of brain regions may be involved and may be right-sided. We don't know that yet. There's multiple factors involved besides cognition and brain changes. There's also emotional, medical, social, and we're trying to study this right now. And these studies need to be replicated in other samples and cohorts. So in terms of future directions, we have a R01 that's getting reviewed actually in just a couple of weeks to look at this idea that financial decision-making might be one of the earliest signs of Alzheimer's disease. And we are hopeful for that. Also, to follow up on the National Center on Elder Abuse study, we are looking at the impact of COVID on elder abuse. And so we have a study that I think will come out soon on that, which will be interesting. So in terms of epilogue, I know I mentioned I was going to talk about policy implications, and this is something that I've been thinking a lot about, particularly in the last year and a half or so. And it's mostly because I've been invited to think more about the policy considerations. So just as an example, when I was talking about the health disparities and the race disparities work, I was invited out actually to NIH to give a talk on these things that I was thinking about at the time, and the work that we had done so far. And it was at that meeting at NIH that there was someone from AARP in the meeting and actually invited me to be a part of this Global Council on Brain Health. And this Global Council on Brain Health is charged with developing recommendations for how older adults can maintain their brain health. I'm one of 13 governance members, along with Ron Peterson and Marilyn Albert and a few others. These are actually people from around the world that were selected for this. It was actually through that I was invited to give a talk on Capitol Hill. And so I gave a talk to the Social Security Advisory Board where I shared some of this work. There were people from Congress that were a part of that as well. And this is the board that advises the Congress on Social Security matters, which was actually kind of a trip. The Department of Justice is interested in this as well, because as I said before, the FBI is interested in stopping financial exploitation of older adults. So the Department of Justice invited me out to give a talk about this and to think about ways that we can try to address this. I was also invited by other policy entities, and so this is an example of a talk I gave at Harvard Law School. And so this is something that, again, this is something that's forcing me and us in the field to try to think about how to make these results that we're working on in academia more applicable to policy. The FTC is something that invited me out to give a talk as well, and to help them try to understand what can be done about fraud prevention in older adults. And also the Financial Regulatory Authority, FINRA, as well, because they're interested in preventing financial exploitation. So, this line of work is not something I pictured myself being involved in policy to the extent that I'm becoming more involved in now. And it's something that, it's one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight that I don't think neuroimaging is at a place where we can use it yet from a policy perspective. There's a lot of people that want to at this point, just based on this work, because the need is so great. So there's really this balancing of trying to figure out what do the findings mean, what sort of impact might these findings have on public policy. So I blasted through this. This is the last slide, and it's because I knew that we were starting a little bit late, but I hope some of this might have caught your attention or your interest. I have a lot of people to acknowledge, which are listed here, and a lot of funding sources that I need to acknowledge as well. So thank you for your attention and time, and I will shut this part down now. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your talk, Duke. I have a question about financial literacy. You mentioned that that's something that can that seems to be related to decision-making abilities. So thinking about the policy implications of that, have you found any effective way to increase financial literacy in under-resourced groups?
I think so. That's a great question. I think financial literacy is one of the most concrete ways to address this issue. The great thing about financial literacy is that anyone can become more financially literate than they are. To my knowledge, there hasn't been a lot of work showing whether there are specific types of financial literacy interventions that are effective. I see that as a very next step of this work, right? Because I think if someone can show that a financial literacy intervention program is associated with less rates of financial fraud or scams, for example, I think that would be a huge benefit. And so I think I wouldn't be surprised if colleagues of mine are actually working on that right now. To my knowledge, I don't know of anything specific, though, that actually has been shown that.
Okay. Thank you. I think we should wait a minute or two to see if we have any more questions. Dr. Steve Small says to send his regards to you. He has to leave early.
Oh, great. Yeah. Great. Thank you, Dr. Small.
All right. I guess given that we started a little bit late and we may be losing people because we're hitting the hour, and I don't see any questions in the Q&A, I think we can wrap this up. Thank you so much for your patience with us as we had our technical difficulties today. And I really appreciate you coming and sharing your research with us today.
Sure. Yeah, very honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great.